The Lower Susquehanna River Watershed Assessment started actually in about 2009, but it grew out of a prior assessment that we were doing for the state of Maryland on shoreline erosion in the Chesapeake Bay, and that was early 2000s, and it pointed to, and it probably makes sense, if you're worried about shoreline erosion, you need some kind of sediments to replace what's being eroded. So that assessment pointed towards the sediments that are coming out of the Susquehanna River Basin. So in 2009, the state of Maryland partnered with us, and in 2011 we began the study of the Lower Susquehanna River Watershed Assessment. What's actually happening in the Lower Susquehanna River? How are the sediments traveling? Where do they travel? When do they travel? How do they enter the bay? Where do they find their final resting place in the bay? And from 2011 to 2013, we partner with a whole bunch of agencies and trying to understand and model where these sediments are coming from, where they're going. We came up with our initial draft in 2013, and then we've been spending the last year or so putting that out for comment within the stakeholder community, and we're on the verge of releasing it for public comment with the goal to publish it in sometime in 2015. We used 3 models for this system. 2 of them had been developed about 10 years ago and focused on the rivers and streams that feed into the Susquehanna. That was actually a linear, one-dimensional model and understanding how things flow down through those streams. When we get to the actual Conowingo Pool, we use a 2-dimensional model that's been developed for about 10 years, and to understand where vertically and horizontally the sediments might have settled out inside that 15-mile long pool. And then the most important model was one that's been developed with agencies like U.S. Geological Survey and other technical experts over 30 years to model the Chesapeake Bay itself. I think what we did is we've taken it to the next step of understanding a very complicated system. I wouldn't necessarily say it's breaking new ground, but it's taking all the available tools and pulling them all together. And we broke new ground in the sense that the findings that we had of the amount of sediment that is currently trapped behind the Conowingo Dam that reaches the bay, nobody had understood how much that contributes to the big brown cloud that you see in the satellite photos after an event like Tropical Storm Lee. And those findings were, I think, eye-opening and groundbreaking. People see the amount of sediment trapped behind the Conowingo Dam as this huge bathtub full of silt. And when a catastrophic or significant amount of rain happens, you would think that, well, it's just like my bathtub and it's going to stir up all the silt and it's going to empty out the dam and it's going to come down and flood the Chesapeake Bay. And what we found out is that in an event like Tropical Storm Lee, really only about 20% of the sediment that reaches the bay has been scoured from behind the dam. And so you do the math, and 80% of that sediment has come from a field in an upstream state that has washed into the river and been carried by the big, fast-flowing waters over the dam and out into the bay. And by the way, it's not just the sediment we found, and we started with the sediment, but what we found out is that it's the nutrients that come along those same pathways. I think the importance is that if your goal is to reduce the amount of things that are entering the Chesapeake Bay, and your thought is that it's all coming from behind the dam, then logically you would want to try to do something to stop that from happening. But once you find out that only 20% of it is coming from behind the dam, that opens up a whole number of other options that you could potentially consider to try to prevent those things from reaching the Chesapeake Bay. And you have to ask yourself, do I want to spend time and effort on the 20% and money on the effort on the 20%, or do I want to spend it on the upstream sources? And that's really up to other decision makers who are going to use this assessment to try to figure out the best way to approach the TMDL and the health of the bay issues. What our study has found, or what our assessment has found, is that it's the nutrients that are impacting the ecosystem more than the sediments. We've modeled where the sediments fall out in the bay, and actually the deepest parts of the bay are the ones that are typically affected most by an event like Tropical Storm Lee. We found that even with the 19 million, and I'll use that figure, I don't know how completely accurate the 19 million is, but even with that amount of sediment reaching the bay, that only 3 out of roughly 90 segments of the bay, and a segment is not, by the way, identical size and shape, but in this computer model there are roughly 90 segments of the bay. Only 3 of those segments fail to meet the TMDL requirements that have been established. So even with a Tropical Storm Lee event, the nutrients that are carried over the dam, whether they're from upstream or whether they're from the pond that's behind the dam, have really negatively impacted only 3 of the segments of the Chesapeake Bay. The assessment looked at a couple different alternatives to potentially mitigate the amount of sediment that's reaching the bay. Looked at first upstream and preventing things from coming into the bay. And there are currently something known as WIPs, watershed improvement plans that local communities and states are implementing to try to reduce the amount of sediment and nutrients that enter into the system. Behind the dam itself, we looked at 2 strategies. One is basically to try to increase capacity, trapping capacity behind the dam, which most people would call as dredging. And the other is to reduce the amount that sits trapped behind the dam. And that might seem like a nuance, but essentially that's bypassing the amount of sediment that is currently coming into the dam and essentially getting it quickly through the dam and downstream. The difference is that if you bypass, potentially, what you're doing is reducing the amount that's trapped behind the dam so that when a storm does happen, there's not as much for it to scour. And there's a more equal load that reaches the bay on any given year. When we looked at dredging, the facts and figures and very, very rough estimates that we put into it, we said and I like to use the football stadium analogy. So there's roughly 80 football stadiums of sediment trapped behind the dam. To take care of 15% of that, which would take you roughly back to the year of 1996, would cost somewhere between $500 million and $3 billion. And there was a news article or an editorial that came out after my testimony that said why the big spread in numbers. And the message I'd like to give you is the cost isn't really about taking it out from behind the dam. The cost impacted by where you put it. So if you have to transport it a far distance, you're going to have an extreme cost. And the case we looked at is taking it out the Atlantic Ocean, which is a possibility because you ask who wants to receive all this sediment that's been coming down for 80 plus years. The least expensive cost is to essentially pump it and deposit it very near to where it currently lies. And so that's the $500 million estimate. But that only takes you back to 1996 and only deals with 15% of the sediments there. The thing that I want to emphasize, though, is that $3 billion or $500 million is just a one-time cost. And you've got sediment coming down every year. So it costs another $250 million a year, roughly, to keep up with the stuff that's coming down from upper Conowingo. I believe your question, though, is probably more what should the decision makers do as far as the next step, and I would leave that up to them because that's what this tool was designed to do, is to provide Maryland or anybody else with an assessment of how the system is working.